I'm just going to quiet now. Well, maybe we'll take this opportunity, since everybody just got quiet. Start. So welcome, everybody, to one of our MBB conversations. As some of you know who've been around for a while, over the last couple of years, we've had these conversations which are meant to bring together people in the MBB area together to hear about topics that really are kind of the interfaces between different disciplines. And like last year, where one of the conversations involved one of the MBB visiting faculty members, this year we're having a repeat of that. So this year, as in every year in the last few years, we have had an opportunity through the MBB group to bring in one faculty member each year who can help basically fill in areas that are not really well represented, although that's not represented, but not well represented at the university, who can help kind of build some bridges and offer new opportunities for our students to hear about areas that they're not necessarily exposed to at a high frequency. So last year, Fred Lairdall was here, who was in the music department, but also psychology, sort of talking about the interfaces between kind of music, in terms of a formal area of music and music theory, as well as music psychology. So this year, the MBB faculty member is Paul Pietroski, and Paul is coming from the University of Maryland in the Department of Philosophy, but Paul works basically at an area which is really the interface between sort of philosophy, philosophy of mind, and linguistics. And what's exciting, I think, for many of us, having had Paul here now for a semester plus, is that unlike a lot of philosophy of language, which has had a history of not necessarily engaging with the empirical sciences, Paul's had a long career of thinking about many of the philosophical implications of the nature of language while doing that kind of work which really engages deeply with the empirical findings in linguistics. So Paul's written several papers with Stephen Crane, who's a very distinguished developmental psycholinguist, looking at questions about innateness and sort of what the starting state is and how children acquire or grow their language. So the format today is that Paul's going to speak for about 15 or so minutes just to give you a sense of kind of the topics that he's been wrestling with. And for those of you who went to the event last fall with Steve Pinker, you're going to sort of hear some familiar themes, although taken from a different perspective. After Paul speaks, then we'll have a few comments from Bernhard Nickel in philosophy, Jesse Snedeker in psychology, and Andrew Nevins in linguistics. And so again, this is meant to capture sort of the departments and the areas that Paul traffics in. We'll then have a bit more of a conversation among the panelists, and then we'll leave some time at the end for questions that you might have for any of the people who are up here. So without further ado, Paul Pietroski.
Thanks very much for coming out on a lovely day. It's very flattering to have people say, come and talk about your work. Unsurprisingly, what I'm going to tell you about today is building on work by lots and lots of people. But time considerations, I'm going to suppress the footnotes. As Marc said, I sort of work at the cusp of philosophy of language and linguistics. And so one of the questions that's been occupying me a lot lately are questions like, what's a word? And how do words relate to mental representations? And when we look at the details of how words relate to mental representations, does that give us any clues about the place of language in human cognition? There are two among many pictures of how language is related to cognition that I'll talk just a little bit about today. One of which I held with lots of people for a very long time, and another that I'm sort of getting tempted by. The first picture, pretty familiar one, is a traditional picture of language as a fundamentally communicative system. That what it's there for is basically to let you pair an already existing mental representation with a public signal. And a second picture is where you would think of human language as a kind of more distinctive aspect of human cognition that actually lets you create representations that have a distinctive character to them. And then if you want to, you can go ahead and associate them with a public signal. But on the second picture that I've been exploring, you think of language as playing an actual creative role in human cognition as opposed to a simply signaling what's already their role. So if you want a slogan version of what I've been up to for the last several years, it's that words are tools basically for making concepts that have some special properties And of course, you don't make them out of nothing. You're making them out of existing mental representations. So if you want a metaphor, I'm thinking about words as sort of like tools you might bring to a kitchen that's already got a well-stocked pantry. But you're going to use the tools to make some stuff that's hopefully interesting that wasn't already there. And a little bit more concretely, what I've been exploring is the idea that what words are in a human language that any 2- and 3-year-old can acquire. They're specifically instructions to create ways of classifying things in systematically composable ways from relatively simple computations. So I'm going to try to be stressing the 3 aspects of that we can think of words and phrases as devices for classifying things, and that's not as trivial as it sounds initially, but that they're systematically composable in quite interesting and distinctive ways, but composable via very simple computations. So I'm thinking of the task that the theoretical linguist here has is quite analogous to the task we face in giving the theory of vision. What you want to be able to do is identify what the basic computations are, hopefully with an eye towards asking how those computations get implemented in human psychology. Okay, so that's a kind of overview, and I'll try to talk for maybe, as Mark said, about 15 minutes or so about filling out a little bit of details. I'm going to simplify a lot and hope some of the complications will emerge in conversation. So, front up question, what are words? I used to think that this was one of the things you could answer after about a 6-month course in linguistics, and so I got interested in linguistics, and 10 years later I'm finding myself asking what are words and how do you understand them and combine them into the phrases and sentences we can understand. But what seems to me a useful perspective on what words are, having beat my head up against taking the question on directly without much progress, is thinking about the flip side of the question, which is what are the basic operations we employ in combining words? So, and then we can ask what do those operations operate on? Right, so one way to ask the question, what are these bunches of representations, is ask what operations do we employ in the course of manipulating those representations. And we actually know something about the operations we employ, or at least we can get some guesses. And we know they got to be pretty interesting operations because you can understand phrases like, I had to write this down for myself, 5 purple bananas surrounded a big rock on Mars yesterday, and then one of the bananas gave the rock a swift kick. Now, whatever it is we can do in understanding language, we've got the capacity to understand that presumably novel, you probably never heard that particular sentence before expression, yet we must be somehow recruiting specific properties of each words and then combining those properties in accordance with some operations that human biology can implement, and in fact the biology of a 3-year-old can already implement, because sentences of that complexity are just not beyond your average 3-year-old. So, okay, what's going on there? Well, let's just focus on one little tiny bit of the phrase, purple banana. Okay, well, we can ask what's the word purple, what's the word banana, but we might also ask, well, what is it you do in combining the meaning of the word purple and the meaning of the word banana to get the meaning of the phrase? And in this case, a sort of obvious kind of first pass answer jumps out. Well, maybe you're doing something like just a simple conjunction or intersection. You got purple associated with a property, I don't know, being purple. You got banana associated with the property of being banana, and you somehow combine those two. That's not as trivial as it initially sounds, because you could make up a language in which the phrase purple banana had a disjunctive meaning, right? I could invent a language for you in which purple banana means it applies to things that are either purple or bananas. No human being would do it that way, but it's a possible way of doing it. So if we do it conjunctively, that's not entirely trivial. But more interestingly, we know throughout the rest of that phrase, think about phrases like a big ant or fake diamond, every banana, surrounded a big rock, gave the rock a swift kick. For every case, we can ask the question, okay, what are the lexical properties and how are we combining them? And what I've been trying to do is explore the idea that an awful lot of this, despite surface appearances, can be handled in terms of some very simple operations. In fact, roughly conjunction. I like conjunction because I think I at least understand how an AND gate works. And while my friends in biology tell me they're not quite ready to give me all-purpose AND gates that operate on a variable, they don't laugh at that so much as they do if I tell them some other things that semanticists would like to have but can't. So what I've been exploring is the idea, well, look, maybe we should pursue the idea that very, very simple operations like predicate conjunction or intersection might lie at the heart of understanding language. But now that just still raises this other question. What is it you're actually conjoining, or if you don't think it's conjunction, whatevering, when you stick purple and banana together? I mean, what is it you're actually doing the conjunction on? I mean, not the sounds of the words, not the number of syllables. So you could combine the number of syllables in purple and the number of syllables in banana and say 5, but that, right? So what are these semantic properties of the words that you could do something like conjunction or another elementary operation on? Here's the thought I want to suggest now, repeating again. Look, maybe what words are doing, like purple and banana and even kick, is giving a kind of instruction to the child who's acquiring the language. Turn this thing into a classifier. Find some way of understanding this word as a way that cuts things in half, then satisfied on one side, the rest on the other, and then you do lots and lots of conjunction. Now that's easy enough to imagine for purple and banana. How does it work for kick? And the thought I've been trying to explore, following lots of other people, is that words like kick, well, they're really fundamentally ways of classifying events. So there's some events of kicking out there. And I'm going to say a bit more about that in a minute. But here's a thought I'm going to try to sketch out and then come back to, and then I'm going to stop. I am not suggesting that human thought or animal thought is fundamentally about classification. If we know anything, I think, from the history of logic and psychology, is there's lots of interesting stuff going on in human thought that involves identifying relations between things, identifying particular individuals, and saying, from my perspective, this one is to the left of that. And these are not modes of thinking that involve basic classification. What I want to suggest is what words do. Every time you've got a word, even if it's an apparently relational word like kick, he kicked him, what you're really doing is invoking a kind of classification again and again. So here's a contrast idea. Very old idea. It goes back, I think, forever. Look, all words do is they stand for concepts. You've got in your mental space various ways of representing the world, and concepts combine however they combine. And what words do are simply give you signs for those concepts, and so words combine exactly the way concepts do. Words add nothing to the equation on this picture. Say, okay, tell me the story about how concepts combine, and tell me in particular how you managed to form up the concept of being a purple banana who kicked the rock swiftly, or being one of 5 purple bananas who surrounded a big rock on Mars yesterday. Nobody in their right mind wants to say, here's what happened. You built up a capacity to form complex concepts over here. Then you built up a capacity to form complex expressions, and somehow you got them in sync. I mean, when you form the concept, being a purple banana who kicked a rock, that feels suspiciously like building up the phrase and understanding it. So the old idea is very tempting. What is it to understand the phrase? It's just to know what concept it goes with it. What is it to understand what is it to understand that phrase? Well, it's to build up the concept. Ask somebody else about how concepts go together. Very long and interesting story to be told about that, about how that idea developed. But here's the idea that everybody for the last 100 years, I think, has gone for, and that I want to suggest isn't on the right track. It's roughly the hook and eye model of how concepts go together, right? If you want an analogy here, think 7th grade chemistry. When they told you, right, what's a molecule of water? Well, it's got 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. And the oxygen has 2 gaps in it, and you want the hydrogens to fill them up and give you a stable whole. We know that's not the right story about molecules of water. But that's a picture, if you like, or an analogy for thinking about what's going on in the thought that, say, a certain guy, Al, kicked somebody else, Bill. Think of the concept of kicking as having 2 slots that want to get filled up. You've got the concept of Al, a representation of somebody you can track through space and time, a concept of Bill. Stick them together, and you've got your, if you like, kick, valence -2 concept with an Al concept and a Bill concept. You fill them up, and you make the whole thing stable. And why do concepts compose the way they do? Quick answer, because concepts have valence properties. Some of them have valence -2, like kick. Some of them have valence -1, like banana and purple. Some of them have valence +1, like my concept of Al and my concept of Bill. What I'm looking for is to get myself a stable whole, right? Crucial to that picture is the idea that concepts exhibit a variety of valences. It's metaphorical, but I got nothing better, so I'm willing to say that that's the right way to think about thought. Traditional picture about language, it's just the same. The verb kick has valence -2. How come? Because it acquires its valence from the concept kick. My concept of Al over here, Bernhard, of course, right? My concept of, but I don't want to say Bernhard's kicking, right? My concept of Al here has valence +1, and likewise for my concept of Bill. That's all very attractive. It's the story we give to all of our undergraduates when they take Semantics 1. But I think every linguist knows in their heart there's just tons and tons of facts that suggest it's not right. So let's take Al kicked Bob. If kicked has valence -2, I want two friends of valence +1. I want my two hydrogen ions to come in and make me satisfied that I'm complete. Then we want to know what's up with Al gave Bob a swift kick. I mean, where's the kicker in the kicky and Al gave Bob swift? Well, it's over there with Al and Bob. You got the verb gave. And I can just say a swift kick is what everybody needs. Right? Cole Porter, right, told us you can get no kick from champagne, but still get a kick out of you. We say in football all the time, the kick is good. The baby kicked once before, and it's kicking again. Bob got kicked in the shin, and Al kicked Bob the ball, which means something like Al kicked the ball to Bob. Right? I actually think that's the norm. Right? I don't think that's a special about the verb kicked. I think, in fact, when you look across languages and across verbs, that's the normal pattern. Right? The verb doesn't look like it has any fixed valence properties. For any particular example, you can come up with a story, but the stories start adding up and looking implausible. And it's even worse, because we take Al kicked Bob and think about Al. Does the word Al in a natural language really have valence +1? Well, I can say every Al in town is a no-good louse. There were 3 Als at the party. This one left early, that one stayed late. And in fact, when you look across languages, it's very common to see that the words we call names behaving pretty much like nouns like banana and rock, philosopher and linguist. And in fact, languages like modern Greek, you have to almost always say something like the Al kicked the Bob. English is a language that lets you not come out with it, but lots of good reason to think that even in English, what you're really saying is something like, that guy called Al kicked that guy called Bob. And that natural languages, in fact, don't have any grammatically atomic names that would be things of valence +1. So what is going on? Well, suppose you thought the verb kick was really semantically like the noun kick. It's a predicate of events. Then you'd say Al kicked Bob is something like this. You got an event of kicking, and he done it, and it affected him. So what I'm doing is just building up a complex classification of events. An event such that it was done by that Al guy, and it got done to this Bill guy. Suppose something like that was roughly right. What would it tell us about the place of cognition in language? I'm sorry, I'm a few minutes over, but I'm about to stop. Look, if it's true that you're a child sitting there with relational concepts like X kicked Y, X saw Y, and you're sitting there with specific representations of objects that you can track through space and time. So if the standard picture of thought is right, that you've got concepts with, say, valence -2 and a concept with valence +1. So if your thoughts are built up of concepts that compose in the ways we've been all taught to suppose thoughts compose. But if the language doesn't work that way, if when I lexicalize the name Al, I treat it as a predicate, guy called Al, and if when I lexicalize the verb kick, I don't treat it as a name for a relation, but as a classifier for events. And if that's what's going on again and again and again across languages, then we'd want to know, why that? Why is it that you don't just lexicalize straight? Why don't you just say, words are just signs for concepts, and they inherit their adicity from the concept they lexicalize? If that's not true, you'd want to know why not. What keeps the kids from doing it that way? And here's, of course, the thought I want to end with, and then maybe we can talk about some more. What you're doing if you're a kid acquiring a language is not merely labeling your concepts and sucking the adicity in. What you're trying to do is find a way to take that concept and pair it with something that you can combine in a fast, simple, and efficient way. So suppose your language system tells you, I want to combine in a fast, efficient, conjoin all day long way. Well, you can't take a relation of kicking a concept of Al and a concept of Bill and just conjoin them. You've got to do a little reformatting. And so here's the thought. Maybe the role words are playing in human cognition is every time you've got a concept and the child is told to lexicalize it, what the child does is says, look, I'm going to associate that concept with a noise, but I'm also going to associate that concept, say kick, with another concept that's closely related. I mean, events of kicking have something to do with the relation of kicking. But I'm going to associate the word sound with the concept of events. Why? Because that'll let me add up the concepts conjunctively and simply at the end of the day. So if you think about a double bookkeeping system where what words are doing are giving the lexicalizer instructions, take that concept and put it into a format that language likes. Once you've lexicalized and you're understanding a sentence, then the idea would be you can understand purple banana and rock that got kicked in just the same way. These are one way or another classifiers you've built up, and built up by doing lots and lots of conjunction, perhaps on abstract things like events. And then we think of the language system as being a system that, to use language from some of Liz Spelke's work with her graduate students a few years ago, is serving as a kind of integrative role. It's telling you, look, if I can take this concept and this concept and this concept, I can get them all into a common format where those concepts could be combined by a dumb computable operation like conjunction, then maybe we could understand how you can understand a sentence like the purple bananas yada yada so fast and quickly and efficiently without worrying about how to put this relation together with that relation the other. That's the picture I've been trying to work out for the last, I don't know, 5, 8, 10 depressingly long years. And I'm thinking there's a way of sneaking up on the question, what's a word? A word is something that combines in accord with very simple operations of language. Why do you have such things? Well, maybe you've got them because it's good to have a double bookkeeping system where the words you're combining get to combine in terms of a dumb operation, and then you can then use the words on an as-need basis to go back and connect them up with the concepts that you were deploying. If it's right, however, that picture really does suggest that we need to drop the idea of language simply as a way of coding our concepts and get back to another old idea, which is to think of language as playing a sign of creational reformatting role, though not to say languages differ from one another in this respect, but it might be that the kind of languages we have really do give us something distinctive, and it might be that the lexicon, the capacity to lexicalize concepts is what's really, really special about human language. So if you want to sort of if you want a punchline at the end of this, it's maybe the composition isn't so fancy in natural language after all. Maybe we should be exploring the idea that what's really fancy are the words and our capacity to lexicalize concepts. And anybody who's studied primates or little kids will tell you that one difference between them is the little kids lexicalize with a vengeance. So I want to just take that idea seriously too, that what's really important about human language is our capacity to take a concept and get a word associated with it. It would be, of course, very nice to know, again, what a word is, idea, maybe it's an instruction for taking a concept you've already got and pairing it with something else that you can combine quickly and efficiently. I'll stop there. Thanks.
So why don't we just go linear order? How about that? So Bernhard, and then Jesse, then Andrew.
So it's been really great to have Paul here for this year, because I have the picture that he's been thinking about. And what I wanted to do today is just say a little bit more about this picture of language as essentially for communication, and then invite Paul to say a little bit more about how it is that the empirical work that he's interested in speaks directly to that issue. So imagine for a minute that the aliens come down from space, and they ask me, where's the MBB conversation? It seems like I can tell them something. It seems like I can do basically the same thing for them that I did for anybody else who might have asked me where the talk is today. What's important is that we all end up in the same room, so we want to coordinate our actions. We do that by coordinating our beliefs. So I ended up here because I believed that the MBB thing conversation was in 104. And at least you might think that I can do the very same thing for the aliens who come down from space. And that gives you an idea of what communication is. The point of communication is coordination. And communication happens when beliefs get transmitted from one person or rational agent to another, human or otherwise. And obviously, language is hugely important for that. Without language, we couldn't have nearly as much and as sophisticated coordination as we in fact do. Science would be impossible, for instance. But you might think that, at least in principle, it should be possible to study everything that I can tell you as one of my conspecifics and figure out what it is that I'm telling you in a way that's common to what I could tell somebody who's not a conspecific, a pretty smart alien. Crucially, someone who doesn't have the same kind of language faculty as me. And so philosophers often think of studying language and communication abstractly. Sure, there's something going on in me and in Paul when we have a conversation. Lots of interesting psychology, but you might think that's just an implementation of a very abstract kind of process that, at least in principle, is describable independently of psychological details. This is the picture that many philosophers have worked with, and this is the picture, I think, that explains Marc's observation at the beginning, which is that for a very long time, there wasn't a huge amount of interaction between what philosophers were up to and then what empirical scientists of cognition were up to, although that happily has changed, as Paul's work has shown. So the first question that I wanted to pose to Paul, or the first invitation, was to say more about how it is that the picture of language and language use that he's been telling us about challenges the idea that you can study language and communication, or the communicative aspect of language, independently of psychological implementation. And at the very end of the talk, Paul gave us a hint, so perhaps he can expand on that hint. The hint is the following. If you think of a word as basically an instruction for something that my mind, my psychology should do, then you might think that the instruction is specific to the kind of hardware that the instruction is written for. It's not forced on you, but you might think that. And if that's the case, then you could see why linguistic meaning for humans is specific to humans, because they're instructions to a human psychology. Along with that, there was another point that I thought it might be nice to talk about some more, which is the contrast that he started out with, the contrast between creation and mere association as a metaphor for thinking about the relationship between the mind and language. Because everybody agrees that without language, our mental lives would be extremely poor. Certainly, none of our sophisticated scientific concepts would be available to us without the kind of communication and coordination that language makes possible. So we wouldn't know about mu mesons on anybody's view. So you might think that no language, no concept, and language helps us create those concepts. So the second question I wanted to ask, or the second invitation I wanted to make, is perhaps we could hear more about the relationship, about a specific kind of creative activity, and how deep the creative relationship runs. So at any rate, what I think is coming out of this is that Paul's work is really forging a new link that I think was not really here before, which is the link between issues that you might have thought are just problems of implementation with abstract issues of how we should think about communication. And what I think is most exciting for someone in my line of work is the way that Paul proposes to redraw that line. With that in mind, with a new emphasis on implementation, perhaps I should yield the floor.
So I guess I'm going to start by trying to summarize, Paul, to make sure that I'm actually understanding what's going on. Then we can sort of work our way through from there. Here was the argument as I saw it. What we know about conceptual combination suggests that it uses some sort of argument predicate type of a system, right? And these predicates can have multiple slots that are open, and we also have things that can fill in the slots of predicates. And then what we know about semantic combination on Paul's view is that it involves some kind of repeated classification mechanism. The world gets repeatedly sliced by each term, and then we somehow impose these sets with some sort of AND operator. Thus, if we accept this, semantic combination is radically different in its mechanisms than conceptual combination. Therefore, language cannot simply be a straightforward reflection of our thought. It's changing the system in a basic way. And the evidence for this came in two kinds of forms, and I'm sure there's much, much more. The first one was Paul's claim that classifying by repeated slicing, right, using this kind of AND mechanism, was a desirable thing because his biologist friends suggest to us that it's plausible to do. And apparently, I guess his biologist friends have reached the conclusion that predicate argument structure is not something that's biologically plausible. I don't know. I'm not sure really at a point where we can evaluate that. It might be a little bit premature to jump to conclusions about that. But the second piece of evidence is one that I very much agree with, right? And that is that if you look at actual terms that are supposed to encode these predicates in language, they can often appear in very different forms which have very different valence properties, right? So we can have give as a transitive, give as a ditransitive, give as an intransitive, give as a noun, which doesn't seem to require anything else to fulfill any arguments. That I definitely agree with. But it seems to me that once you have that piece of evidence, there's actually a number of directions that you could go in. One is to take the step that Paul has taken and to say that this suggests that words are not wearing this predicate argument structure on their sleeves, that language doesn't have the same basis to its concepts as conceptual structure does. The two must be separate. Or you could go in two other directions. One possibility is you could argue that both conceptual structure and semantic structure use argument predicate relations, but in fact we can alter the kind of meaning that a particular word has with some sort of conversion rules, for example. Many people have written about these, how a transitive verb could be converted into a ditransitive by some sort of lexical rule that was available. The other alternative that's usually talked about in psycholinguistics and in linguistic theory is the possibility that valence isn't actually a property of terms like kick or dog, right? But in fact, those are concepts that don't have any particular valence, and then they get put into structures, conceptual structures or semantic structures, which impose valence upon them. So we could argue the conceptual and the semantic system are identical, but this valence is coming from somewhere else, right? That in order to fully flesh out a concept like kick, you have to put it through some other operator, which turns it into something that has, a valence of 3, for example, -3. So that's one possibility. They're both the same, and they're both working on argument-predicate relations. There's just some flexibility in the system. The other possibility seems to be that maybe both conceptual combination and semantic combination involve the simple AND operation, right? If this is a desirable thing for our semantic representations, then why wouldn't it be a desirable thing for our conceptual representations? If the biologists cannot use predicate argument structure to make semantic space work, then presumably they're not going to be able to use it for conceptual space either. So there's no real reason to conclude on that argument, right, that language and thought are radically different kinds of systems. So I'd love to hear Paul talk a little bit more about this. I think the only other point two other points I wanted to bring up. One is that, as I'm sure Paul will agree, the complexity always lurks somewhere. In describing language as a system, a semantic system in which you are simply adding together two concepts, once you make this step of doing that, you're going to have to complicate, of course, the concepts that you're adding together, right? So he brought up the case of blue bananas, but we only have to go stepping over into small and large bananas, right, to realize how complex those concepts are going to have to become. If we're simply going to be adding together these two concepts, we now cannot think about adding together their extensions, because it's certainly not the case that all big things and all bananas are going to have the overlap, which is all big bananas, because I don't think any bananas fit into the category of big things, right? We're going to have to really change the way in which we're talking about that concept, which is fine. I think everyone wants to do that. And of course, even 3- and 4-year-old kids know this, and there's multiple studies showing that. I guess the other thing I wanted to add is that, unlike Bernhard, I'm not quite so sure that our mental lives would be completely and utterly, constrained and miserable if we didn't have language at our disposal. I actually take great comfort in the fact that Susan Golden Meadows' deaf isolate children seem to come up with really quite interesting thoughts, and then they devise ways to explain those thoughts. Right? So they seem to be able to create systems that will reflect those concepts, even in the absence of any clear linguistic model. All right.
Well, Paul has already had a very big give of things to talk about, just stretching the boundaries there. So I'll just raise a couple of issues that sort of are personal points that you don't necessarily need to address. But one, I am very, very, very glad that Paul's emphasis is on the idea that what's unique to language, one of the more unique things to language, is not necessarily the modes of composition, but the idea of having a huge lexicon and the means of lexicalization. This is something I've been trying to tell 3 authors of a certain paper for many years, and I'm glad that this is getting some teeth, that the notion of lexicon and lexicalization is really something I think unique to humans, and even among cognitive systems, quite unique. So I'm very happy to see that being fleshed out. I have a couple of questions that are lurking in my mind about what constraints a semantic system should impose on other linguistic modules. So when we work with a strict predicate argument system, at least from the point of view that I'm used to, that can often be said to impose certain constraints on what syntax and the mapping of syntax to other components can look like. Specifically, the notion that if we take function argument architecture seriously, then a lot of things that might otherwise be thought of as coordination have to be treated as subordination. And this particular debate has come up recently in my life in arguments about the syntax of the Pirahã language spoken in Brazil, which is a language that appears to have means for doing subordination that look very much like coordination. And the question is, most computer scientists and philosophers, logicians know that one can apply what's called syntactic sugar and turn anything that has subordinating syntax into something that has coordinative syntax. For me, the crucial evidence is always going to come, I think, from the prosody of these languages. Okay? When you look at things that have subordinating syntax, they have a prosody. If you take sentences like, John said that it was raining, and John said something, and that something was that it was raining. There you have 2 very different prosodic characterizations, prosodic profiles. And so for me, one of the best ways that we can get at whether the syntax itself has a subordinating or coordinating architecture is by looking at cases of known coordination, which have a radically different prosody from ones that seem to be either coordination or subordination. And I assume that in many cases the child, the language learner, has the logical options for both, but that the prosody might actually push them in the direction of treating things in terms of subordination. A final issue that I think is important to keep in mind is, given Paul's system, do the basic lexical categories, noun, verb, adjective, play any fundamental role anymore? The way that Paul has sliced the pie, everything is basically monadic. And to me, it's rather interesting that with adjectives, and of course some of these nice examples come from adjectives, blue, purple bananas, you do have predicate intersection. But of course, we do have, Jesse brought up big and small. I think some of the very interesting cases are things like fake. Fake bananas is definitely not at the set of fake things. Ex-husband, former president. These are alleged, sure. These are cases that certainly, it's an interesting challenge to think about them, but they're the exception with adjectives, perhaps. But in the case of verbs, this requirement of having a certain specified adicity is really something that seems to be much more persistent in the category of verbs than adjectives. So, no matter how much you want to coerce, I put the car. You cannot coerce that at all. There are certain types of coercions that are not possible. Put really seems to be a predicate which requires, two internal arguments. And so, to me, I don't really care about the details of how Paul would handle put or former, but why it is that verbs seem to have much more rigid adicities, and adjectives really don't. And the lexical categories and the notion that traditional grammarians all the way to now have slotted things into these categories comes, I think, really from the intuition that these things behave very differently in the way that they have combinations being obligatory or more modificatory. So.
That's great. Thanks very much for those. So maybe it's the illusion of how the time passed. I think I want to respond in order. So let's start with Bernhard's invitation for me to say more about the relation between language and communication. So first thing I'm going to want to do is say, look, let's distinguish languages that bees can acquire, languages that a 3-year-old human being can acquire, and languages that a physicist or a mathematician can acquire. I'm not sure that the languages of mathematics are natural objects in the sense of being objects of study for the natural sciences, but I suspect that the languages that bees and little human kids do are. And so my question as a linguist is then going to be, for the languages that human beings naturally acquire, what's the relation of them to communication? And I'm afraid my boring answer is very, very complicated, because communication, I suspect, is a massive interaction effect that relates language and the rest of the mind, as well as the kitchen sink. So it's a well-known phenomena that what you can communicate in a given situation depends massively on the context and what you take it to be reasonable for the other person to be assuming in the context. I think those are real phenomena that deserve study, and I actually, some of the work Bernhard and the people who he's building on, I from the Gricean tradition, I take to be right, absolutely, philosophers of the language should go do it. What I do think, however, is that the study of meaning just really does need to be divorced from that. I think it was just a mistake to suppose that meaning is somehow to be reconstructed up out of communication, because that seems to me like trying to reconstruct the law of gravity out of what happens when you see leaves falling off of a building. So the alternative picture I'm much more inclined to take is the picture I think we got from the study of vision, which is what we should ask is, what are the basic operations on inputs that allow us to create something like a primal sketch of what's going on that can then serve as a sort of place on which a lot of other stuff from other aspects of modular cognition gets pinned. So I'm thinking about the primary task of a semanticist as being, what is the primal sketch we generate when you understand a sentence? And that will be a, I suspect, necessary but by no means sufficient condition for figuring out what's going on in the communicative exchange. So, so I'm going to take the opportunity to backpedal on anything I may have said that made it sound more ambitious about that. When I'm talking about basic operations being implemented in human psychology, I'm thinking about the sort of stuff that Marr told us to look for when we're trying to study, do cognitive science in what I take to be a really serious way. You ask, what's the fundamental operations that allow you to generate an initial representation that can then serve as input to lots of subsidiary operations. Now, this means that a lot of the work, of course, then lies with, even if I'm right about the primal sketch being massively conjunctive and a bit eventy around the edges, how does that then interact with other aspects of cognition? And I'll try to come back to that when I talk about the issues Andrew had raised. So I'm all in favor of communication and belief fixation. I just think that has much less to do with the notion of linguistic meaning than philosophers have thought. which isn't to say meaning isn't germane to communication. It's just I don't think we should reconstruct meaning out of communication. So Jesse raised a whole series of interesting points. So let me first say I don't want to suggest that semantic composition is radically different from what's going on in thought. Rather, the suggestion is semantic composition deploys a very small subset of the operations that are available in various piecemeal ways around the rest of thought. So I assume that if you're, to borrow Randy Gallistol's favorite example, if you're a Tunisian desert ant trying to find your way home, you have some fancy representing to do that I suspect involves some anding along the way amongst lots of other things. My suggestion is not that semantic composition isn't doing what we find elsewhere in animal cognition. On the contrary, what I'm suggesting is that semantic composition is employing only a very restricted number of the operations we see exploited elsewhere in human cognition. And I'm assuming, again, that concepts really do have valences for better or for worse. So Jesse raised the interesting possibility maybe concepts don't, and that somehow valence emerges out of something else. Yeah, that could be. For better or for worse, I'm assuming concepts have valences. That's the way thought works. And so I'm supposing, indeed, that in thought, we do have predicative argument structures. So I think that when the ant is finding its way home, it had better be representing a relation between home, the position of the sun, and its location in space and time. And I don't know how the ant finds its way home if it doesn't have a kind of polyadic representation that is getting filled up by slots being provided by inputs. So I'm assuming, in fact, that that's rife throughout animal cognition. But what I'm skeptical about, and the throwaway remark about my biologist friends was this: if we ask what would it take to generalize predicate argument combination in a way that lets you do it recursively, open-endedly, and for anything that comes along, well, we know how to do this. Frege and Tarski between them basically showed us, right? So when you study modern logic, right, you get a picture of what that would be. And I don't think it takes much to feel like, ooh, I got to implement that in the mind of a 3-year-old. That's where I'm skeptical that the predicate argument stuff is the source of, if you like, the recursive, open-ended, free and fast computations we're doing. It could be, but especially when we get around to thinking about things like relative clauses and quantificational structures, the apparatus that logicians actually import to do this is extremely powerful. And this now connects up with Jesse's point at the end and then getting into what Andrew had suggested. The power we would need, right? We actually have a good measure from the study of modern logic of how powerful a machine would have to be to do predicate argument combination in a fully general and recursive way. And I don't think we see any signs of that kind of power being exploited in lexicalization and composition in natural language. So to just give 2 very small examples, no natural language that I'm aware of takes the relational concept like taller or bigger or heavier and just lexicalizes it as a straight monomorphemic X bears R to Y, right? We have this circumlocution in English, Al is taller than Bill. There's an and a than in there. Other languages circumlocute in other ways. What you don't find is just doing it, bang, absolutely straight and systematically across the board, right? Between, I suppose, has got to be a relational concept par excellence. X is between Y and Z, and that's how we got to say it in English. X is between Y and Z, not X betwixt Y, Z, as there was a nice, just express the relation straight. Whereas if you had a machine that could do predicate combination recursively and was free to take any concept in thought and just bang, make a word out of it, you ought to be able to do that stuff straight. I think we just don't, I think we fail to see that kind of, we fail to see the power, if you like, of the Frege-Tarski-Montague apparatus exploited in natural language. And that makes me wonder, as somebody again who really cares about poverty of stimulus arguments, right? If the power is there, but it's not being exploited, gee, why? I mean, here's another hypothesis. The power isn't being exploited because the kids aren't even thinking about exploiting that kind of power. But that would have to be a long argument about look across languages and lexical items. You don't see what you would expect to see if kids could do predicate argument combination recursively. Okay. that point about tall and between connects up with Andrew's Mark too about saying that we're in agreement about thinking the lexicon is what's really important here. So lots of people in the room may know, but I'll tell you if you don't. Most conservative ways of counting what a word is, human being, even a small one, about 5,000, up to 50,000 if you're well-read or counting words non-conservatively. Best counts for other animals about getting arbitrary sign meaning associations, about at least an order of magnitude less, and the 450th comes just as hard and laboriously as the 449th, which was just as hard and laborious as the 448th, whereas, of course, little kids just bang, go. Now, that suggests to me there's something about lexicalization that's special, and so I'm already stuck positing one special thing about humans. I don't want two. But it does then, if lexicalization was special, it does then suggest what Andrew was also suggesting, that the real hard work, if my sort of hunch about this is right, the real hard work lies not so much on figuring out what the fancy combinatorics is, because the combinatorics isn't so fancy. The hard work means for every lexical item, go and find out what representations from which modules is that word interacting with and how. So if you like, how did the demands of be a dumb classifier get negotiated with the demands coming from the other end? And for what it's worth, my hunch is that that's where the action and the money lies over the next generation, thinking about how these demands from different but simple systems get negotiated out at the interfaces. Last thing now about words like put, absolutely right. If you say that words are classifiers, then you got to say, well, how come we sort of do know that you want to say it, John kicked Bill, and John kicked is somehow a little marked and special? And why is it you can't just say John put? Well, got a boring answer for this. It's because it's an arbitrary fact of English that we in fact, well, I shouldn't say it's an arbitrary fact of English. It's a historical fact about many languages, right, that we in fact do use verbs to indicate relational concepts. Well, if you've got a verb that's being used to indicate a relational concept, but the verb is, so to speak, cramming that relation down into a classifier, well, the relational thought is still there, and so it wouldn't be surprising if statistically you use the event classifier very often in the presence of a representation of who did what to whom. Well, if you're a little kid seeing that, you'll presumably be sensitive to the statistical information, and so you might well represent in your verb kick, oh yeah, I'm an event predicate, but I also very often come with an agent representer and a patient representer. And if you're the verb put, well, now I think we'd want to ask the question, what is it about the concept of the verb put, as opposed to, say, place, which is in the same semantic field but a little different? What is it about the verb put that makes it interact with the language system in a way that says, look, that one is just going to be really, evidently seems to be really uncomfortable for speakers without representing the putter, the puttee, and the where it got put. But from a purely computational semantic perspective, yeah, I'm going to dig in and say, actually, John put would have been just fine. It's just that we don't like it for other kind of reasons. If you like, here's the flip case that goes my way, the concept of jimmying, which I got from our postdocs at Maryland, Alexander Williams. You know how to jimmy a lock with a screwdriver? I mean, the concept of jimmying has got to be like one of the best cases for saying the concept involves the instrument, right? There's no jimmying without an implement of jimmying, but you can just say Alexander jimmied the lock. It's just fine. So if you like, there's a case where you know full well there's something about the concept and a participant in the event. It's absolutely crucial, the concept, but doesn't appear in the sentence. I suspect what we have for complicated, historical, and again, relations having to do with the interface between the language and the conceptual system, facts about concepts like put, where you say, well, look, yes, you're an event classifier, but as a matter of fact, when you appear in a sentence, make sure you also get in the sentence represented the three things. But not because the verb has adicity 3. The verb has adicity 1, and then there are some independent facts saying if you're going to express a put thought, make sure you get the putter, the puttee, and the place put in there. With Jimmy, we don't care. Good question why. But again, I think that's going to be an issue of how do specific lexical items interact with the specific concepts they're interacting with.
Yeah.
So I guess I wanted to jump back to your point about, so I had suggested that one possibility was that both conceptual structure and semantic structure had the properties that you wanted to attribute to semantic structure. And you said
good.
We have ample evidence that we can conceive of things in a way that seems to not just involve this repeated anding, right? Therefore, this is not the nature of conceptual structure, and we're going to have to deal with the discrepancy. And I thought it was interesting to note the case that you were looking at, right? You're talking about, for example, spatial navigation, right? And there's a real question of what exact object we're trying to carve out when we talk about the conceptual structure that precedes language structure. Are we talking about any form of representation anywhere in the mind, or do we have a privileged one in mind? And that, of course, is going to depend on who you talk to, right? If you say, or Liz, what you might want to have is many, many different modules with very different representations that cannot communicate to one another, that are only communicating with each other via language. But you might have a very different kind of model in mind. You might have a model more along Jerry Fodor's lines, where you have some sort of central conceptual representation that's going to get mapped onto language. And then we can talk about what of the information that's out there in these more modular systems actually gets converted to this more central representation. And maybe it's the one that has these properties that you want to attribute specifically to semantics. Now, of course, then, for many people, it starts to become very slippery exactly what you want to attach the label language to. Do you want to attach it to the conceptual system or to the semantic system? Does it depend in part on when you believe they evolved or where you believe they come from over the course of acquisition? But it's still out there, the possibility.
Now, look, right, there's a position which would say, in fact, insofar as anything I've said is right, what it was right about is something much longer ago, right? Lots of animals came up with the trick of coming up with, of doing everything classificationally. But I think when we look at the details of what happens if we try to do, say, tall or big or, God forbid, every classificationally, well, you see, it can be done formally. And in fact, it's not even that hard to do it formally once you set yourself the homework problem of doing it. But, events are what I talked about here. It's just the tip of the iceberg, right? I mean, basically, when you insist on taking what seem to be relational concepts and reanalyzing classificationally, you require a kind of abstraction, right? So if you think about the relation that somebody bears to one another when they kick them, you can think about events as something you get by abstraction on thinking of that relation. When you think about, well, now what is it going to be? In fact, you both raised the question, well, how do you, in fact, begin to think about big as a classifier? Well, with big, I think I'm at least lucky, is that it's plausible that independently plausible grammatically that in natural language, when you say big ant, really what's there is big one ant. There are languages in which you can see there's a kind of agreement suggesting there's kind of covert pronominal expression there. And then it becomes possible to analyze big one ant. Adam is that big one ant is something like the ants have the following kind of interesting property. Adam is a big one. I mean, it's doable and you can work it out, but I find it hard. I find it hard to believe that that's, if you like, the fundamental animal way of representing the relation of one thing being bigger than another. But I take the point in the abstract that nothing I've said is an argument that this didn't happen much earlier, and then in fact lots of animal cognition is like this. So maybe in fact, lots of primates and other mammals are doing this, and what was special about human language is we just are pronouncing it. But then I think that does raise the question, well, how come other folks aren't doing it too, right? So part of the issue is, right, we want human language to be just special enough, right? We want there to be something special about it that makes it plausible that not everybody associates their classifiers with noises.
Can I just so far what hasn't constrained the argument is what kind of empirical evidence might bear on the issue. And I guess the one question is, let's imagine that the externalization of these issues was just a byproduct, right? We just evolved the vocal tract and we got vocal learning, and all of a sudden it's just externalized. And there's some linearization process which has to make it go this way, rather than different ways. But then what's going to say whether the animal concepts are different than the human, except for the scientific concepts which they couldn't acquire?
Yeah, right.
So what do we take things that they can acquire? How are we going to know what the lexicalization is actually doing?
Good. Okay, well, so as a linguist, I got to object to the facts about how kids do and don't lexicalize, that's not empirical evidence, right? So yeah, some of us think that,
Yeah.
I mean, those are empirical facts to be considered. But here's if you like, a concrete prediction of the model. If John kicked Bill really is all being done classificationally, and that somehow being the subject of is soaking up a relation of doer, and being the direct object to be soaking up a relation of done to, then prediction, that's not special about human language, right? We should find other animals at least having the capacity to have event concepts, at least in the sense of here's the one responsible and there's the one that got affected. Now, in that case, it's pretty straightforward that other animals have got to have. I mean, how can you be a social primate without keeping track of who's hitting who? But I think that's at least a recipe for how to ask what the empirical questions in your sense are going to be. What we do is say, if the fundamental computation is basically conjunction, then what extra gizmos do we need in lexicalization or for purposes of understanding sentences? And here the preposition system is a good place. So what kind of relations are we indicating with prepositions? And other things equal, right? I'm going to say expect to find those available in other animals, because the little kids have to have access to them, but they're not getting access to those extra gizmos just by the trick of lexicalization and conjoining, so they must have been there independently.
Wait, those gizmos exist only so that you can have a semantic system.
No.
Right. Okay. I'm confused.
No. Look, I mean, I would assume.
So, what do the prepositional gizmos exist for prior to needing the semantic system?
Well, I mean, if I'm assuming that we can use. I mean, we use prepositions in many ways, of course.
Right.
But often, say, if I say, so the purple banana was on Mars. Okay, the preposition on. Right. I suppose that's indicating some kind of spatial relation between things, right? So, right, the spatial relations, the object. So we're going to have sentences. We have prepositions. They're often used to indicate a spatial relation between things, or a participation relation between an individual and some event. So, right, there was a kicking by John of Bill. So those kind of relations, either spatial relations between objects, relations that objects bear to times, or relations that events bear to one another in time. I mean, all that kind of usual stuff, right? That's for me, so to speak, the stuff that's around the edges in the sentence being introduced by either the functional vocabulary, prepositions, or grammatical relations. That's not the stuff that's getting introduced on my picture by adjectives, nouns, or verbs. So if what's distinctive about human language is using adjectives, nouns, and verbs to turn everything into classifiers, then the other stuff, other things equal, should be stuff that's available to other animals, and it's getting recruited for purposes of turn everything into a classifier as much as you can. So when I have kicked Bill, what am I turning Bill into? I'm turning Bill into a classifier of events, but how? By exploiting some stuff from language and reaching for this idea of being affected. But now I got to assume the idea of being affected is independently available to the 3-year-old. There, I think it's plausible. Now, empirical question: the full range of the extra gizmos the kid need, are they going to be? Would they have been independently available, or am I stuck saying, oh yeah, and language also gives you a this twitch and a this twitch and a this twitch to make the system work? I would hate that, right? So I want to stick with the strong hypothesis that what's new to language is exploiting your capacity to conjoin on the adjectives, nouns, and verbs, and that everything else was there in place, and we'll see how crazy that ends up being.
Can I just ask a quick question about that related to use of prepositions, where it seems to me that they are there to introduce classifiers? One of the classic cases that we like to show that verbs seem to have very finicky adicity properties is the distinction between devoured and dined, right?
Yeah, sure.
You can't say John devoured, period, and you can't say John dined a pizza.
Yeah.
And if you want to say John dined a pizza, you have to say John dined on a pizza.
Yeah,
and
right.
so you have to actually use a preposition there for basically to aid the adicity of the verb.
Well, what's certainly true is that the concept of devouring seems like a relational concept par excellence. I mean, and this way, notice, interestingly different than, well, we talk later about whether it's like eat. But so let's suppose it's a relational concept. Okay, right, the verb got lexicalized, and of course it's a high register verb. That's one of these fancy English verbs, devour, right? And
it's in a lot of kids' stories. But
huh?
Never mind.
No, right. No. All I mean is, right, it feels different, right, and it's right even down to right. Right now we're going to go into the thing, but so English, right? You throw together the Germanic stuff and the Latinate stuff and yada yada. Okay. What's certainly true about devoured is the verb is, so to speak, going to tell the kid if you want to like get the full thought out. So you want to like get the full relational devoured thought out. You're going to do it with a preposition rather than another grammatical argument. So, but that doesn't tell us anything about the idicity of the verb, right? That doesn't tell us the verb has valence -1 or -2 or -7, for all I know, right? So there's a distinction between the verb having a valence in the sense of having slots that filled up the way oxygen was supposed to, and it being part of the lexical information that says, oh yeah, and for this particular verb, make sure you have a direct object or make sure you have a subject. I mean, I'm thinking about this from the semantic perspective, in understanding the sentence, or in particular understanding the verb, are you understanding the verb as having 2 slots to be filled up, or are you thinking about the verb as a predicate of events? And the verb can be a predicate of events even if the verb also says, oh, and by the way, make sure I come with a particular kind of direct object, or in the case of put or devoured, that you use a preposition. Right? Notice, too, we do have to ask the question, why do we have prepositions at all? Right? Why do natural languages have these funny functional items? Why don't we do everything with open class lexical items? So why don't we have verbs? Right? I say John is from Paris, but I can't say John from's Paris. I can do this weird thing of saying he hails from Paris, but I can't just take the relation from and make a tensed verb out of it. Why? Well, I'm going to say because prepositions are non-open class items that are there to just drag in cognitive relations that you've got independently. They're what you use precisely when the trick of moneticizing and classification doesn't get you all the way. On the other hand, on the standard picture, I think it's quite a puzzle about why there are prepositions at all. I mean, what are they doing there? Why don't we just have words for them?
So I'm sure that you have a solution to this, right? But it seems like there is some tension between the way in which you're thinking about the semantics of verbs and some of what we know about how children learn verbs, right? So in learning verbs, children seem to be very sensitive to the kinds of structural environments that they occur in, and they seem to be making some kind of a mapping between that and event structure, right? So all the lovely work that Lila Gleidt and her colleagues have done, suggesting that a verb that's in a transitive context is more likely to be interpreted as, say, a cause motion verb than in self-generated motion verb. That comes out pretty naturally if you're thinking about these semantic and syntactic structures as being similar in the sense that they have the same number of arguments, right? It seems like it's a little trickier on this perspective.
Maybe, but so I sometimes think it would be useful for us to go through a 10-year moratorium, right, where nobody uses the word argument, right, because in the history of the subject, argument plays multiple roles, right? So an argument is something that a function takes to a value. An argument is something that a verb can have, so its direct object, say, can count as one of its arguments. And from a semantic or conceptual point of view, right, an argument of a concept is something that fills one of its empty slots. Now, it's quite tempting to say that that's not a pun. Really, function argument talk, concept argument talk, verb argument talk, it's all getting at the same thing. Right? It's getting at the idea one way or another filling a slot. But it could be that it's just, well, it's not a pun, but it's that's a theory that we adopted that maybe we have to get past. So it could be that there's, if you like, verbal argument in the sense of, does the verb have as part of its lexical specification, I need a direct object? And then there's also a semantic notion of argument which says, for purposes of understanding the verb, how many like conceptual slots do you think of it as being associated with? And what I'm suggesting is these things need to come apart, because on the semantic side, I'm saying this is easy. We always have one slot. And I think all the Gleitman stuff is all diagnosable as saying, look, what the kids are doing is unsurprisingly, using information about whether they hear verbs coming with subjects or direct objects to figure out which concept is being lexicalized, and for purposes of building up the lexical entry, which extra bits of information you got to attach to the lexical item.
But it's sort of a curious view then, right? Because you have kids who attempt to, or seem to be mapping something about the surface structure of the sentence directly to the concept, and apparently semantics is living over somewhere here, not involved in that at all.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay. Right. That's the picture. That semantic composition is not a direct reflection of the kind of composition that's going on in thought, right? And the reason I find myself driven to that, as attractive as that picture is that I think that picture then makes a mystery of all the cases where you get a mismatch between the adicity of the concept being lexicalized and the uses of the word. So if you like, I could imagine a mind that's like ours in having a relational concept of kick and a relational concept of from and a relational concept of between. And what it does is lexicalizes each of those concepts with a tensed verb that has a fixed adicity and never behaves any otherwise. So the verb is understood as having exactly as many semantic holes as the underlying concept. There's no problem imagining such a mind. I just think as a matter of empirical fact, those are not the kind of minds that little kids bring to the task of lexicalization. So I find myself stuck then saying, geez, what else? What other picture of semantic composition could work? And then if I'm going to have another picture of semantic composition, I really want that picture to be simple, because I know there's going to be work to do figuring out how the particular concepts get mapped to the particular lexical item. So, I mean, another way, I guess, saying this in short form is what lots of people put aside as complicating cases. I get a kick out of you. I think that's really the core case. And John kicked Bill is the thing that's more complicated than meets the ear.
I know we have to be moved out of here by 5:30. Why don't we take some questions from people in the audience, and then we'll have a couple questions for anybody here.
I've got one more. No one else.
I do too. So.
What I'm trying to address Marc Hauser, because I think that so what's the difference between the animal concept and the human concept? My answer is that there is no difference at all in the structure of the animal concept and of the human concept. And so my question for you is, are we sure that concept has an argument predicate relation? And if you use the term predicate, it comes to my mind like that something can be like inside predicate or cannot be inside predicate. So it's kind that we are using like a decision difference, like a logic difference. So can be yes or no, and so are we sure that
Well, I mean, look, I don't think we're sure about anything about the structure of thought. Just for better or for worse, I don't know of any other account of how animals could form complex thoughts with the kind of systematicity that at least seems to be there locally if we didn't have something like the valence picture. What I do agree with you about, however, is I don't know how people are so confident about, if you like, intuiting the adicity of a concept, right? So take the concept eat. Is it like fueled up, so it's one place? Is it relational, a concept you bear to something else? Is it three-place because it's a relational to something you eat and a kind of norm of it being good for you? I mean, Chomsky's example, there's something weird about John ate a tack, unless John is a robot who gets nutrition from tacks, right? But I would say, look, it's not my problem if it's hard to ferret out the adicity of a pre-linguistic concept. I mean, I'm saying whatever the adicity of the pre-linguistic concept is, you pair it with a monadic word. It seems to me a weakness of adicity matching hypotheses that they require to even confirm or disconfirm them, some way of saying, and I have independent reason for thinking that the transitive verb kicked really does lexicalize a concept with adicity 2. I said, well, okay, what's your evidence that the concept really has adicity? I'm going along with it that it has adicity 2, but if we're being serious, what's the evidence that it really has adicity 2 as, say, opposed to adicity 3 or 4? So in that sense, I want to agree with you. I don't think we can have any solid views about what the adicity of a particular concept is, though I suspect they've got them. So if you ask me, what exactly is the adicity of the ant's representation of the sun and the solar ephemeris? I don't know. That's a wildly hard question. But I suspect that we track things through space and time, and so we have singular concepts and classifiers and relations, but very hard to know for any given relation, if you like, how relational it is. And I want to say, lucky for me, I don't have to answer that question, because my hypothesis is, for purposes of semantics, what you do is say, I don't care what the adicity of the pre-lexical concept is, find a way of pairing it with something monadic so you can deal with it as monadic on the fly, no matter who its friends are in the rest of the sentence.
But don't you think you're missing the fact that this adjective-verb difference in obligatoriness of argument seems to come from the fact that verbs describe generally events and adjectives describe generally states, and something about the way these things are lexicalized packages in a notion of
yeah, I mean, look, I'm missing endlessly many things, right, that presumably among them, right? So the short answer that I'd say, look, so I think there we want to start from Mark Baker's book on why we even have adjective, verb, noun distinctions to begin with and how to understand them grammatically. And I'm inclined to agree with you that on the whole, adjectives lexicalize states, though monadically. I think verbs, action verbs anyway, and perceptual verbs do lexicalize events, though monadically. So now prediction on my point of view, the state-event distinction ought to be more robust and found in animals other than humans. Hopefully that'll turn out to be plausible. But I'm of course not suggesting that there aren't rough correlations between grammatical categories and kinds of concepts. It's not an accident that we use names to roughly go with the singular concepts, even if they're monadic. But as you full well know, these days it's awfully hard to know what the status of being a grammatical category is. So what is that makes you an adjective as opposed to a verb? Is that a fundamentally lexical thing? Or is that an interaction between the lexical item and the grammatical structure it sits in? You ask me, is the word kit, the atomic lexical item, is it a noun or a verb? My answer is going to be no. What it is a way of making the relational concept monadic, and if you prefix it with a determiner, you got yourself a determiner phrase, and so it's a noun. You put it next to some grammatical arguments, well, I guess then it's a verb, right? So I'm not going to want to go with the idea of saying that there are fixed lexical categories in the sense of those are, if you like, you always lexicalize as an adjective, verb, or noun. What I think, roughly along the lines with the distributed morphology folks, is that the labels A, V, and N are things that we have to understand as themselves being relational notions, a relation that some concept as lexicalized bears to some other stuff going on in the grammar, but not like I've got a detailed story about that.
Take two more questions. Can you talk a little bit about the different arguments and adjuncts?
Right. So very fast for any non-linguists in the room. Arguments, things like subject and object, and John kicked a bill. Adjuncts, things like the prepositional phrase, John killed a bill on Tuesday. Short answer, from a semantic point of view, very, very little difference. What I think is going on with John killed Bill, the arguments, the verbal arguments, basically being the subject of and being direct object of, think of them as dedicated prepositions, right? It saves you from saying there was a killing of John by Bill. So the grammatical relations are just playing the role of introducing one of these independent cognitive relations. From a semantic point of view, I don't think there is an argument adjunct distinction. I think that's what's interesting is to ask why there is that structural distinction in language at all. So if you're like, why don't we just speak entirely eventishly, right? So there's this question, why do we have nouns and determiners and functional stuff? And I suspect that's something to do with the fact that our thought really is independent of language, wanting to be subject predicate. And for better or worse, this is how we negotiated out subject predicate and massively modular thought with a system that wants to do this stupid classification stuff. But as a semanticist, I say, look, I don't see the argument adjunct distinction. That's the absolutely unqualified version that will have to be qualified tomorrow.
One more question in the back.
You spoke earlier about the Pietroski analysis and the first order competitive
Yeah.
logic, and you said it has too much power to take plausible to the children. So I'm not clear. Is there any role in what you've been discussing, for the Tarskian or Davidsonian kind of analysis of the structure and what sort of structure we need?
Yeah. So that's the stuff I, so to speak, grew up with. The short answer is I think it's both too much and too little at the same time, right? So there's a sense in which first-order logic doesn't even begin to give us enough power to see what we've got in natural language. Lots of studies of the kinds of relations and quantification we've got in natural language can't be done in those terms. My own view is that you can't even do the rocks hit the bananas properly with a first-order system to get what's going on in natural language. But what I had in mind about the power is that the systems that Frege and Tarski gave us basically say, take a predicate of any adicity you like. I'm ready to deal with it. You want to introduce a 17-place predicate? Fine. We can do a 17-place predicate. As far as I know, no natural language has anything above 4. 4 is extremely dubious. I suspect it's not there. 3 are minimal, a handful of cases. I suspect they're really not there. But in any case, not 17. And certainly not 17-place relations involving higher quantificational notions, which is perfectly doable in Frege's system. So that's the sort of thing I meant by saying, if you take the basic recursive operations in those languages as the fundamental ones, well, they would give the child resources for introducing words of a sort we never see kids introducing, and will allow them to create constructions we never see kids acquiring. And so that's what makes me not want to take that stuff as basic, but rather see it as, look, that was our first late 19th, early 20th century pass at how a language could be compositional. And now we want to ask the question, okay, and what in fact operations are getting implemented in making our languages compositional in the way they are. And if somebody shows me, no, that's the best bet, I'll go with it. I'm suspicious that the kids are deploying that much computational power in understanding words like kick and bigger.
So please join me in thanking Paul and his friends.